welcome to the Rural Well. I'm Bridget and Loren is with me today. We have the distinct pleasure of interviewing another podcaster because 3 is even better than just the 2 of us. And you might just be out working on your garden seed catalogs, building that garden map, dropping some bales for hungry calves. And you might also be trying to squeeze one more thing in the shop to work on before spring's work. Wherever you might be, we're so glad you're here and listening to us. We know the ag industry has its challenges, but we are right alongside you and cannot wait to connect and inspire one generation to the next. Loren, how are you today?
Well, it's minus like 19 where I live Celsius. I have no idea what that is in Fahrenheit, but it's cold and it is bright and sunny. So I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome Katelyn with you, Bridget, to the show. Katelyn and I first met, I don't know, Katelyn, was it like maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago? And I had the distinct pleasure of listening to her as she hosted an event with Farm Credit Canada. And she still works with Farm Credit Canada. She's a tireless advocate for agriculture, but in particular is her podcast. It's the Rural Woman Podcast. And she has brought to life the stories of women all across Canada and the US and the UK. Their influence in agriculture. So sit back, folks. This is going to be a treat. Welcome to the show, Katelyn.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I feel like I'm sitting with my friends having a cup of coffee, and we get to do the funnest job of podcasting right now.
So true. So true. And I think it's interesting because even before we were recording, we were already telling stories of some of the women in ag that, we work with or we've been, kind of inspired by. And, there's a lot of good stories out there. There's a lot of incredible people in agriculture that has kept. One of the earlier podcasts that Bridget and I did, there was this quote and it was talking about how agriculture is really the wisest investment. And part of that is because we invest in one another.
It is my absolute pleasure to do so. And to be honest, I always say that starting my podcast was one of the most selfish things I've ever done. As a person who did not grow up in agriculture, I didn't know what I was doing on my farm. I married my husband back in 2016. He is a multi-generational farmer through and through. And he has a love for agriculture like nobody else. And most farmers are like that. And it was very apparent to me very early on that there is a culture in agriculture. And I was very interested in learning more about it. And the podcast came through, like I said, a selfish thing. I wanted to hear the stories of women in agriculture in the podcasting space. And back in 2019, that wasn't being done. So the millennial in me, the entrepreneurial spirit in me was like, well, if somebody's not doing it, then I guess I have to do it. And that started me down the rabbit hole of Googling, how do you start a podcast? And I followed the 10 steps the people on the internet told me to do. And here we are 6 years later, sharing these incredible stories. And it's for me, it's turned into a job, but it never was a job for me. And it still isn't a job for me. I get to learn by hearing people share their most vulnerable selves with me and to hear the passion in their voice of what they do on their respected operation is honestly one of the best feelings that I get. And the best part is I get to share it with everyone else too, who wants to listen.
Katelyn, I've got 2 questions. And one of them is, how many episodes are you up to in the podcast now?
That's the hardest question. We're well over 200 interviews now of the podcast. We have other special types of episodes sprinkled in there. But yeah, we've interviewed well over 200 rural women. And like Loren said, from all over Canada, the US, the UK, New Zealand, and it keeps expanding. The coolest thing for me is when I started, I didn't know who would listen to the podcast. Mm-hmm. I didn't know if it would be of interest to people to hear these stories. So originally I interviewed about a dozen women who I had met on Instagram and thought, I'll start with 12 and see where it goes. Well, what happened after that was after that initial 12, well, then people would listen and say, hey, I'd like to share my story, or I think you should talk to this person. Have you heard of this person? And so then it just kind of organically grew from there. And like I said, I didn't know who would listen. I was like, I don't even know if my mom would listen. Spoiler alert, she doesn't. But there are close to nearly 1 million other people, 1 million downloads now that have listened and keep sharing those stories and find the courage in themselves to think like, hey, I have a story I can share too. They put their name forward, or I meet people traveling throughout the winter at conferences I get to speak to. So it's always been a progressive movement forward of our stories being shared. And I think, when I say the stories of women in agriculture weren't being shared, they weren't being shared in a way that were celebrated. A lot of women that I meet, including myself, we look at our lives and we look at our stories and we look at what we do as just normal. It's ordinary. But I'm here to tell women that there's extraordinary in their ordinary. There are people who will find inspiration in what you're doing on your operation to change something in theirs, to inspire them to do something differently, or just to look at something differently. I don't farm the same way that my neighbors do, and that's okay. We don't need to do everything the same. We can look to see what others are doing to find inspiration or to learn just a different way of doing things. Nothing is right or wrong in agriculture. And I think that's been the unique thing of over these 200 episodes. No two stories are the same. But we draw back to being rural women, and having that passion is something that brings us back together.
I once heard someone say there's 66,000 different farms in Ontario, and there's 66,000 different ways to farm, which is so true in a way, right? Like we all have a different perspective and we all have a different story. And I that's one of the reasons why your podcast, I think, resonates so well with our rural women. Is the preciousness of story. I'm curious, Katelyn, tell me about those stories and how they impact. Like let me rephrase that. Maybe what's the value in telling our story?
I think for me, initially, when I answer that question, and this is for me, the value in when somebody is vulnerable and will share their story, we learn something from that. But also it allows others to know that it's okay to share your story. It gives them the permission to do it. Someone has gone first, so you can go. And that's what I've always said. Like through the years we lived through a global pandemic, and in that people found podcasting, and it was an incredible thing for me to see the number of people who put their hand up and said, I can do this too. And I am their number one cheerleader. Since then, there has been so many women in podcasting and agriculture that have come through, including my two friends sitting here. And I couldn't be happier about it, because people before me have shared their story. They've shared their struggles. They shared their wins, which allowed me to say, hey, I have my own personal journey that maybe somebody else can benefit from. So I think generationally, when we think of women sharing their stories, I think of my own farm and my husband's grandmother, his Ukrainian grandmother, Baba. She's 98 years old and she is still with us. And she is one of the strongest women that I know. And to hear the stories of what she did on this operation way back when inspires me in so many ways. What she does or what she did is not what I do every day. I'd be too tired for that lady. But it inspires me to keep going and the resilience of it. I don't really even like the word resilience because I feel like that is not a badge of honor, but it gives us the inspiration to make it our own and to move forward. And I think that's what sharing stories should do, is to give you that little bit and piece of information to make it your own.
So between guests that you've had or listeners, have you had anyone come back and let you know that because of listening to you or chatting with you, they've had a bit of a light bulb moment in their lives?
There have been a few that are absolutely memorable for me. The messages and the DMs and the reviews left and all of that, like that's my social proof that I need to keep going. But it's the special ones that come up to you and speak to you are really, truly special. And I believe that Lauren was standing with me when I got one of my most memorable ones when we were in Calgary at the Advancing Women Conference. I had a young girl come up to me and she was very nervous to talk to me, which sometimes people get nervous to talk to me. And it's funny because I am the most socially awkward introvert who has ever talked into a microphone. So no need to be nervous. Like I'm just as nervous to meet you. But this young girl came up to me and she introduced herself and she thanked me. She told me that she's been listening to my podcast since she was 16 years old. And for years, she listened to my podcast and she grew up on a farm. And her parents encouraged her to go off to school to do something else because there was no place in farming for her. And being a woman in agriculture, it was going to be hard and that, it wasn't really the place for her. And she was coming to tell me that I believe she was in her first year or second year of university and she was going to school for agriculture because she had been inspired by the women sharing their stories and how they persevered by being told that they couldn't do it and she was going to do it anyways. And I still get speechless when I think about that story, because I think of myself, I think of Katelyn as a 16-year-old and being told that I couldn't do things and looking for inspiration elsewhere to see that, yeah, I could do this and I am going to push through. So that will always be a story that I remember. But yeah, there's been tons. One woman, I can probably share this now. She came up to me this past winter at a conference that I spoke at, and I share my story in my presentations, and I share about how I went through it in my first year of marriage. I had a career off farm that I planned on staying at. I was not going to be an active member of this farm. I was just going to live here, but I was still going to go to my spin class on Saturdays and the farmer's market because God forbid I wasn't growing a garden or anything. And I went through it and I burnt myself out at both ends, really trying to hold on to my old life. And I took a leave of absence. And during that leave of absence, I learned how to drive, well, first the lawnmower, which was terrifying. And then we grew up to the tractor and the swather. And eventually I swathed an entire field at harvest. And I knew that day I was not going back to my job. I knew that this was the life that I wanted and I was going to jump in with my boots on. So I share that story in my presentation and this woman comes up to me. She says, "Hi, my name is Lindsay, and I'm going to quit my job tomorrow." And I was like, "Beg your pardon?"
Oh, holy cow.
She was like, "I'm going to quit my job tomorrow. You have inspired me to quit my job." I was like, "Oh my God, please don't."
We should have a plan, a notepad.
Right, like, you have a plan. And she did. But however, this was the caveat to push her forward into what she was planning on doing. She had more of a plan than I did. I'll just say with quit my job. I didn't really have a big plan, but.
Oh. Wow. Oh my. And that's a memorable moment. But yet something was already rolling around in her mind that she needed to do differently. You were the spark that helped her make that change, is really what it came to. And we probably all have more of those moments than we acknowledge.
Absolutely. I can say this, and hopefully this doesn't make Lauren blush, but the time that I met Lauren, I was hosting this incredible conference that we were at. It was International Women's Day. It was rah, it was everything. And like I had mentioned before, I'm very introverted and somewhat socially awkward. So I always feel like, you know how Beyonce has that alter ego when she goes out? I definitely feel like I have that alter ego. when I am working on a stage. And Loren completely broke it with her presentation. I sat and I listened to Loren for about 10, 15 minutes into her presentation, and I had to leave the room because I was sobbing, because the way that she was describing the state of mental health in agriculture, it was such a reality check for me. And I will never forget that presentation because of the way that it made me feel and how it inspired me to continue to talk about mental health in agriculture, even if it feels like that's all we talk about. That's how many more times do we need to talk about this? But I've seen it. I've seen it in different mental health presentations across the country. When we talk about it and when we share our story, it inspires somebody else to say, I need help. I need to share this. I need to help my neighbor. I'm seeing signs, right? So we need to keep talking about it. We need to keep sharing these stories, and those little tidbits that we talk about in our everyday lives, we have no idea that impact that it's going to have on somebody else. And although it sometimes feels like, how many more times do we have to talk about this? It's going to affect somebody differently, even if this is the 7th time they've heard it.
Yeah. And I can't help but go back to what you mentioned there. You said 2 words a few minutes ago. You said the word vulnerability. You said the word resilience. You said, resilience isn't a badge of honor. And I'm like, oh, preach it, sister. Like, true resilience is vulnerability. Right. True resilience is a willingness to share our story. And I think that's, what you bring in, what we hope to bring is the sharing of the story and allowing a safe place to be vulnerable, because that's where resilience is birthed. Instead, we've learned somehow in our community that you just kind of pull your boots back on. You don't tell anybody anything. You shove it down a little further and you don't feel anything. You just keep working. But that's not resilience.
Right.
It leads to burnout, which is far too common in our ag communities. So when you mentioned the word vulnerability, I wondered, Katelyn, that piece, how difficult is it, do you find, in general, for rural women to allow themselves to be vulnerable? And are we seeing a difference that way?
Yeah. In my experience, especially when I guess first came into the industry, it seemed kind of like pulling teeth. And it always seemed like there had to be somebody that kind of went first. And to be a person that goes first can be really difficult. For me, I think in a way it was easier for me to go first because I was an outsider. I was the outsider to be like, man, this is a lot of work. Like, aren't you exhausted? When do you sleep? Like, how do you get through this? Like, how do you, whatever. And then, the layers kind of peel back. They're like, yeah, it is hard. I do struggle with this. I have been struggling with this. Specifically, in our community, there's a lot of women who bear a lot of children. And postpartum depression is just not something that people talk about.
I know. And once you talk about that, it's like the floodgates open.
Right. And there are things that women recognize, even that they didn't even know they had postpartum depression. Yeah. That they were like, well, I just thought that's how you were supposed to feel after you birthed a child. And it's, there's just, again, it's the tidbits of wisdom that we're sharing in those vulnerability that you don't know you don't know what you don't know. And you could learn something from somebody just sharing a story around the coffee table, right? I think a lot of times vulnerability can get confused with oversharing. And I think there's a distinct difference. And I know for myself, I'm pretty open in sharing the struggles that I had coming into this industry. And it wasn't until I really did some work on myself to realize what those struggles actually were and what my tools were going to be to move forward that I was able to look back and talk about those things. There's a saying that, talking from your scars versus your wounds. When you're talking from your wounds, a lot of times those can be oversharing. And some people, feel comfortable doing that. I don't. Like if there's something actively going on in life, I don't feel like, telling everybody on Facebook about it is like copacetic. Like, I don't know, maybe wait a little bit, but that's me. And other people are going to cope and do things differently. But I find that the best strategy in being vulnerable is really understanding the feelings behind it. Like, why did I feel that way? Why did that happen? And why did it have that effect on me? I think, being vulnerable can look different for different people. But at the end of the day, like when we are sharing our stories, we're being vulnerable. We're sharing a part of ourselves that can be scary sometimes. And vulnerability is scary. And I know there's a lot of people that run away from fear or don't want to feel that fear because it can feel pretty icky. But once you do it a couple times, once you dip your toe in it, it gets a little bit easier to share these stories.
So when it comes to sharing those stories, what about folks doing it one-on-one instead of just on a podcast? Do either of you have a little chunk nugget of advice that tells someone it's okay to go find that outlet to share your story? Maybe it's not a podcast, maybe it's something else, or maybe it is a podcast.
Lauren, you go first.
Okay. I have the absolute privilege because I am a therapist. And so I have the absolute privilege of walking with people through some really painful stories. And certainly, part of our goal is to learn the balance between vulnerability, kind of opening yourselves up and setting boundaries and realizing your story is precious. And the two are like, they're not actually opposing one another. They actually work with fluidity between the two, because when you do open yourself up and you say, oh, no, this is kind of scary, and you have the power to close it back up. But the basis of both is learning how precious your story is and understanding and then accepting how precious your story is. And, I can't help but say to the people who are listening, whether you're a woman or you're a man, this part is true for both. Your story is precious. You have purpose. You have incredible value. And our community is richer because of it, because of you, right? Because of that value. And so, I do have the privilege of walking with people through really painful journeys, but I also have the privilege of intimately knowing, the success or the freedom they feel when they finally do tell their story. And I say freedom not lightly, but it is freeing. You mentioned postpartum depression, and rural women have a higher incidence than urban women. I was talking with a professor at Penn State University, and she was studying the impact of postpartum depression in rural areas. It was unbelievable, some of the stories she shared. I just can't, because Katelyn, you are right. There was this lack of even acknowledging, oh, this is what postpartum depression looks like, because it's like, well, this is just what I do. I just suffer through. I just keep moving. And this is my job as a rural woman, or as a woman in ag, or as a woman, period, kind of thing. And I think when we open up those stories and when we allow for that vulnerability, we can say, you know what, you're not actually alone. And I want to walk this journey with you. And so I have the benefit of both of those pieces. And I think, Katelyn, you have too. And I think that's why you shared some of those like wow moments. And I think, as a little bit of a message to the listeners out there, that's a privilege for you too. When you walk alongside with someone, you do kind of carry some of the weight, but you also enjoy the freedom from that. You enjoy the benefit and the outcome of that. And certainly, Katelyn, that's what you spoke about. Yeah. There have been times I've worked with women who, frankly, they would describe themselves as in a pit. And I don't know if any of our listeners are in that place where it just seems so dark. They can't even see light. And so for those people, we can walk alongside and we can hold their hope for them because they can't hold it right now, but we'll hold it for them. And so that is a really special and precious place to be, even though it is dark, it is hard, and it is clawing back for sure.
Right. I think the only thing that I want to add to what Lauren said, and you had said, you can open it up, you can share, but you can also decide when to close and when it's not a right fit. And there's a lot of times that it's not a right fit. Emotional safety is a thing. If you choose to share your story with someone and it turns out that that person wasn't the right person to share with, don't make that the last person you share it with. There are other people out there that are willing to listen and that can help you through that. And whether that's a friend, a family member, a neighbor, a counselor, let me tell you, the number of counselors I have been to, it is like speed dating for me. I've had a discussion a time or two in the last couple months of like, what are your hobbies? And like, I really thought about it. I was like, I think therapy, because the amount of money that I have invested into this is, I could probably buy a boat instead, right? And go out on a lake somewhere. We don't have lakes here, but if we did, I could probably have a boat on it. But going to therapy and making that a normal thing in 2025 to me is still so strange. There are folks in my personal life that I've shared with, like, yeah, I have a therapist for this and I have a counselor for this, and they were like, you have multiples? I'm like, yeah, because I talked to them about different things, and they were absolutely dumbfounded. They're like, how did you even start sharing with one? I'm like, you just got to start. You got to start somewhere. And to know that if it's not feeling good, you think you need different help somewhere else, it's okay to flip flop around. It's not a bad thing. You don't have to marry the first one, right? Like, you can shop around for counselors. You can shop around within your family of who it feels safe to talk to. And knowing that it's okay to stop sharing with that person if it didn't go well. But to know that there are other people out there that will talk to you and that will listen. If you've had one bad experience, I feel you. I've been there. To have your emotional safety taken away from you is one of the worst feelings. And I'm right there with you. And it does get better. There are people there that want to talk to you. They want to hear from you, and they want to help and walk alongside you. So know that when you find that fit, you're going to know, and it's going to feel really good. And eventually, it's funny. 2025 has been a very rough start here for me. I've had, I'm going to call it the privilege of walking alongside a friend who I've known for a very long time through a mental health crisis. And it's been hard. And I've taken on a lot, and it's brought up a lot of feelings for me. I am not a professional counselor. I am not a registered anything. I am just a human who's been through it. And it has been a privilege to walk alongside her as she's figured out her journey. And please know, like, this can happen to you. You can go through something and it can turn around later in life, and you can help that person through whatever it is to get the resources, to get the help, just to be a listening ear. And it is a privilege. It is an absolute privilege to walk alongside somebody. And I am grateful for the experiences that I've had in my own mental health journey. And I'm grateful for the people who helped me then. And I am even more grateful that I get to help people with that now, whether that's one-on-one personally or, by sharing incredible stories of women in agriculture. It's a pretty cool life I have.
Every time we record, there is a nugget of usable information that someone can pull from here. And I feel like today's big nugget is that emotional safety is real and it's okay to share. But you know what? It's also okay not to have to share. Our lives don't have to be Instagram worthy every second. We don't have to share everything. And that's all right too. So I don't know if there's a professional perspective on any of that, Loren, but that's what I just saw.
No, I think that's honesty and wisdom. And, I think what Katelyn shared there was it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to keep seeking until you find help. Seek it and you'll eventually find it, right? Okay. Wow. What a pleasure to sit at this table. I know that we are virtually sitting at the table together, but, Katelyn and Bridget, you are both treasures, and I'm so thankful. And, to those of you who are listening, as Katelyn shared and as Bridget shared, it is okay to not be okay all of the time. It is okay to seek out support, and it's okay to keep seeking out support until you find that place where you really click and where things can be safely explored. So thank you. And at this point in the podcast, we are actually going to shift gears a little bit. Today, I hope it's okay. We actually have two quotes because there's a real practical quote and then there's a not so practical quote. Okay. So, so the first quote is a little bit on the funny side, and it might be because my son, Christopher, has recently purchased this TV series, and it has brought back yesteryear for me. So baling twine, we call it baler twine here, but baling twine turns every farmer into MacGyver. And the author of that is unknown. So really quick, we have to explore that, because has that been your experience at all in agriculture? It is absolutely mine.
My dad, I grew up with my dad saying of anything will work for a hammer in case of emergency. So yes, that's all true right there.
MacGyver.
My goat fence is currently tied together with baler twine. So
I'm trying to think of all the things that we've used binder twine for. Certainly, tying up gates, hanging lights, actually, like brooder lamps. We've used it. We've also tied it together for a line in the garden when you're trying to do a straight line, or putting in a fence line when, because it comes in those great big rolls. And so, of course, we can use it for that. But it's also really helpful when you need a belt. When you are out in the field and you've been trying to tackle sheep and your belt gets broken and you are in desperate need, you can whip that binder twine around your waist and you're good to go for the next, tossle. Okay. So the other piece of this is for those who are listening, we invite you in the show comments to let us know, what have you used binder twine for? And then our next quote, which is a little bit more on the reflective side, is we have neglected the truth that a good farmer is a craftsman of the highest order, a kind of artist. And that's by Wendell Berry. So we've neglected the truth that a good farmer is a craftsman of the highest order, a kind of artist. What do you think?
They are, because a farmer will craft so many different areas. It's almost like painting the Mona Lisa, but you're doing it from two different sides, and the front and the back as well, because you are building this operation, this family, you're caring for livestock. You have so many facets of it that you build into this marvelous image. Sometimes behind you, it's crumbling. But in the greater sense, I think that as farmers, we've become masters of a craft and masters of many, to be honest. Kind of goes back to the MacGyver.
Absolutely. I've had the absolute privilege of being in many rooms with many farmers. And I think the one thing that I've heard that I am very quick to correct when somebody says, I'm just a farmer. That just in there, I ask them to take it out, because there's very few industries where you are the be all and end all of your business. And sometimes that can fall on one person's shoulders, and that's a lot to carry. So don't discredit being a farmer. It is an absolute privilege. It is an absolute it's a lifestyle. It is a business. It is absolutely everything. It's all encompassing. My favorite, thing to say is there is a culture in agriculture, and the different people who get to run different operations help make this world go round. So it's a privilege to be a farmer.
Yeah, I love the quote, but I also think it's almost like a jigsaw puzzle, because we all play this intricate role in different ways. Just as you mentioned, Katelyn, as a farmer, I produce animal livestock and I have, business, but part of it is the working together with other farmers who work in sales and equipment dealership, or, and those groups that kind of support this very extensive, and if I can say the word eclectic, and yet authentic or, passion. So yeah, I do. I love this quote as well.
Well, as good as the quote is, I always like to see a smile on everybody's face. And one of the best ways to do that is to ask something a little bit fun of the three of us. And then it makes its way into our comments when folks listen and respond with their own answers. All right, ladies, we always talk about what are our passions? What are our favorite things? I just heard Katelyn talk about goats, and they may or may not be your favorite thing depending on the day, is my guess. But what is something you have just absolutely loved to do? Loved to do it. It was the best part of your day. And in the last year or two, you've realized you don't love it as much. That's something that's maybe less of an interest for you. Does anything come to mind?
Well,
everybody give up their pandemic sourdough habits.
I've got 2 loaves of sourdough in the oven, just for the record right now. It's called polenta sourdough.
There you go.
When my kids were little, I quilted a lot, and it was so healthy for my wellness, because in the afternoon, so we homeschooled. So for the first 2 or 3 hours of the day, it was, doing chores, and then we'd get schooling done. And then they were kind of free in the afternoon to go and explore and create what they wanted, and, learn kind of from their natural environment. And some of those natural environments, so I was a firm believer, were outside, particularly when they had forgotten to pick up their toys. And so there was an occasion where I would, lock the door, and they would be outside for a period of time so they didn't come back in. That sounds very vicious. They were all very safe. Just for the record, they were old enough. They were very, very safe and very, very creative. And it worked well, because it meant I had an hour to sit at my quilt rack and I would hand stitch. And you have to understand that when you hand stitch a quilt, for me at that time, I was just following a chalk line. It was absolutely mindless. It was so life-giving for me, but I don't do it anymore. And I've wondered, there's been different times where I'm like, why, it's not anything wrong with it. I loved it and I still love it, but it's not part of my everyday. And I think it's just, that was a coping strategy for me during that time in my life. And now I utilize different coping strategies. So
anything come to mind, Katelyn?
You already disclosed mine, and it's goats. I don't like them. When I got here, I am such a big animal lover. I love livestock. I think every livestock should be a pet. I grew up in the city. If I found a cat in the back alley, it was mine, because finders keepers. So getting into livestock and livestock production as a very big, sensitive city kid, it was, it was rough for me. And to allow me to go to an auction to buy things with money to bring it home and figure out how to raise it, it was fun for a while. It's not fun anymore. It's cold outside. The goats are mean to me now. I just there's a friend of mine who very similar, grew up in the city, and we have this saying that we came up with, we wish we could be the goat keepers that we thought we were going to be before we got them. And we're not. We done with their bull. So
I every lambing season, I go through that spout, especially just after lambing, they're so demanding, and the bottle fed babies are crawling over me. And you're friends with Sandy Brock. I don't know how she does it. Sandy Brock is amazing because she's so well organized, and but there is always a time in the season where I'm like, why are we doing this again? But sure enough, that season, passes by and I think we should get more.
I don't have that thought ananymore. There's no
away.
Up. It is only down.
Oh, that's amazing.
So if anybody is in the market for 2 spoiled boar goats named Kitty and Babs, like they're in the backyard, come get them. So.
And all the accessories. They go.
Yes.
I know this maybe sounds a little bit different. It's not necessarily a thing, but for so much of my life and career, as when you're the oldest child, you always have these to-do lists that you had to do. You had to be dad's hired man. You had to be mom's maid and chief babysitter, etc. So I think I was born with a checklist on a clipboard with a pencil, so I could check things off immediately if they were done. You know what? In the last year or so, I don't get as worked up as I used to about that because I'll be able to finish it tomorrow. And that's brought me a little sense of peace that I don't have to finish everything I wrote down today. A little selfish, but I just decided sometimes I'm not going to get it all done. That was a big learning moment for me, by the way. I wasn't good at that.
That's amazing.
I love that.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end, I think. But thank you. My goodness, Katelyn, what a pleasure.
It has been. I just want to keep going. I could talk to you all day. It's been so fun. Thank you so much. And thank you for doing what you're doing and bringing these conversations to the podcasting space. It has been well received. And thank you so much.
Folks, it has been nothing but great fun visiting with friends this afternoon. And so if you have questions or comments, leave them for us. Make sure to check out the show notes. But above all, now go listen to Katelyn's podcast. And that is Katelyn Duban. She does the Rural Women podcast. If you want a little starter episodes, both Loren and I have been on there, and we greatly enjoy her and value the things that she has to share. So thank you so much for being here today. Y'all have the rest of your day. Let it be wonderful.